It was dawn on September 12, 1683. A pale gray light crept over the shattered walls of Vienna, revealing a city on the brink of annihilation. Smoke rose from the ruins, curling into the cold air like the last breath of a dying beast. For 2 long months, the defenders had held their ground against impossible odds. Their faces were hollow, their bodies starved, their hopes fading with each passing day. Inside the crumbling fortifications, men and women gazed at the horizon with a mixture of despair and desperate faith, praying for a miracle.
Your Majesty,
Beyond those
the
walls
Ottomans are
stretched
pressing.
a sight
We
both
must
magnificent
Not
and
yet.
terrifying.
Patience, Captain.
The largest army
moment
the
is
Ottoman
not
Empire
ripe.
had ever assembled on European soil lay arrayed across
Now,
the plains.
charge!
200,000 soldiers stood ready to strike, their ranks glittering with weapons, their banners snapping in the wind. Cannons glistened in the early light, their barrels blackened by months of bombardment. The earth trembled beneath the endless march of men and horses. The empire of the crescent moon had come to claim its greatest prize, Vienna, the gateway to the heart of Europe. At the center of this colossal force stood the Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, cloaked in silk and gold, his eyes fixed on the city with cold satisfaction. For him, victory was not in doubt. The siege had lasted far longer than expected, but the walls were collapsing, the defenders starving. To his mind, the conquest of Vienna was inevitable. Once the city fell, the road to the rest of Europe would lie open. From
Vienna
there, he
lives!
would march through Germany and France, and perhaps one day, even to Rome itself. The dream of Ottoman dominion over the West was within his
Venimus,
grasp.
Vidimus, Deus
Yet
vicit.
history was preparing a cruel surprise. A force unlike anything the Ottomans had ever faced was on its way. A weapon of flesh and steel, of faith and fury, one that would soon turn what seemed destined to be the greatest Ottoman triumph into one of the most catastrophic defeats in history. To understand how this came to be, we must look back several decades to the time when the Ottoman Empire stood at the very height of its power. Since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans had swept across 3 continents. They controlled the Middle East, dominated North Africa, ruled the Balkans, and had pushed deep into Central Europe. Every sultan who ascended the throne in Constantinople dreamed of capturing Vienna, the jewel that guarded the gateway to the West. If Vienna fell, there would be nothing to stop the Ottoman armies from marching onward to Germany, France, and beyond. But the defenders of that gateway, the Habsburg Empire, were themselves divided and beset by enemies. Emperor Leopold ruled over a realm exhausted by decades of war and political strife. To the west, France under Louis XIV, the Sun King, threatened Austria's borders. To the north, Protestant princes distrusted the Catholic emperor. And to the east, the Ottoman tide grew stronger with every year. In 1681, the crisis came to a head. A rebellion in Hungary against Habsburg rule gave the Ottomans the perfect excuse to intervene. Sultan Mehmed IV seized the opportunity and called upon his most ambitious general to lead the campaign, the Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha. Mustafa was a man consumed by pride, ambition, and greed. He dreamed not only of victory, but of eternal glory. The conquest of Vienna, he believed, would make him the greatest commander in the empire's history. It would win him unimaginable wealth and perhaps even a throne of his own. He began to raise an army that Europe had never seen before. 200,000 men gathered under his banner. Among them were the Janissaries, the elite infantry of the empire, trained from childhood to fight with absolute discipline. There were the Sipahis, the armored cavalry, riding magnificent Arabian stallions and wielding lances and curved sabers. From Crimea came the Tatars, fierce and merciless horsemen. From Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania came contingents eager to share in the plunder. Behind them
Venimus,
followed tens of
Vidimus,
thousands of
Deus
irregulars, looters, adventurers, and desperate men who hoped to win their fortune in the ruins of Vienna. But what made this army truly terrifying was not its numbers, but its firepower. The Ottomans were masters of artillery. They brought with them more than 300 cannons, from small field guns to massive bombards capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of kilograms. These were the same weapons that had destroyed the walls of Constantinople 2 centuries before, and now they were aimed at the walls of Vienna. In the spring of 1683, the Great March began. Through the plains of the Balkans and across the lands of Hungary, the Ottoman army advanced like a flood. City after city surrendered without a fight. Those that resisted were burned to the ground. Fields were trampled, villages emptied, and the terrified people fled westward, carrying tales of horror that spread panic through Europe. In July, the Black Tide reached the gates of Vienna. Inside the city, chaos reigned. Only 15,000 defenders remained, a mix of imperial soldiers, local militias, and volunteers. Against 200,000 invaders, the odds were hopeless. Emperor Leopold fled with his court, leaving the defense of the city to Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, a man known for his courage and iron will. Starhemberg understood that there was no hope of defeating the Ottomans outright. His only chance was to hold the city long enough for help to arrive, if help would come at all. Europe was deeply divided. Religious wars and political rivalries had fractured Christendom. Catholic and Protestant princes distrusted one another, and many doubted whether Vienna's fall would truly threaten their own lands. But in Rome, one man saw the siege not merely as a war between empires, but as a battle for the soul of Europe itself. Pope Innocent III believed this was no ordinary conflict. To him, it was a holy war, the final stand of Christendom against the Empire of Islam. He launched a desperate diplomatic campaign, sending envoys across Europe to beg for aid. He promised blessings, indulgences, and gold to any prince who would rise in Vienna's defense. Most rulers hesitated, but one man answered without hesitation. King Jan III. Sobieski of Poland was no stranger to the Ottomans. He had spent his life fighting them on the eastern frontiers, leading his armies across the vast steppes of Ukraine. He understood their tactics, their arrogance, and their weaknesses. When the call for help reached him, he saw his duty clearly. He would march to Vienna's aid. It was not only a chance to save Christendom, but also to secure his own place in history
This brave
as the defender
general
of the faith.
helped save the city from the
Sobieski
siege.
began to gather his forces. He knew that his army alone could not match the Ottomans in numbers, but he possessed something that no other army in Europe had: a weapon forged through centuries of warfare on the eastern plains. It was a cavalry so feared and so effective that it seemed almost mythical. They were called the Winged Hussars. Each Hussar was a member of the Polish nobility, trained from childhood in the art of war. They rode powerful horses bred for speed and endurance. They wore suits of armor made of overlapping steel plates, light enough for movement but strong enough to withstand arrows and sabers. Over their shoulders, they draped leopard or tiger skins, not as decoration, but as symbols of status and courage. And on their backs, mounted to wooden frames, rose great wings covered with eagle feathers that rustled and whistled in the wind. When they charged, the sound of those wings was said to strike terror into the hearts of their enemies. Their primary weapon was the copia, a 6-meter-long lance made of hollow wood, balanced perfectly for the thrust. With this, a hussar could pierce through multiple enemies in a single charge and then withdraw it for another strike. When the lance broke, he drew his saber, a razor-sharp curved blade capable of cutting a man in half with a single swing. But their true strength lay not in their weapons or armor, but in their discipline. They rode in perfect formation, knee to knee, shoulder to shoulder, striking as one. Their charge was a hammer blow that shattered armies. While Sobieski assembled his army in Poland, the siege of Vienna grew ever more desperate. The Ottoman cannons pounded the city day and night, tearing holes in its walls. The defenders fought to fill the breaches, often hand to hand, as waves of Ottoman soldiers surged forward. The air was filled with smoke, dust, and screams. Food ran short. Disease spread through the crowded streets. Starvation loomed. Yet Starhemberg refused to surrender. Every night he climbed the ruined battlements and looked westward, searching for a sign of help. And every night, all he saw were the endless fires of the Ottoman camp burning across the plains like a sea of stars. Across those fires, Kara Mustafa grew impatient. He had promised the Sultan a swift victory, but the siege had dragged on for months. Reports began to reach him that a relief army was forming in the north. He dismissed them. He had 200,000 men, enough, he thought, to crush any rescue force that dared approach. He would keep half his army at the siege and use the rest to destroy whatever small coalition the Europeans could muster. It was a fatal mistake, for the army marching toward Vienna was no small coalition. It was a united host, the largest Christian army assembled in a century. Responding to the Pope's call, princes and dukes from across the Holy Roman Empire had sent their troops. Charles of Lorraine brought imperial regiments. John George III of Saxony sent his soldiers. Max Emanuel of Bavaria led his Bavarian troops. Even the smaller German states sent what they could. By early September, 70,000 men had gathered in the hills north of Vienna. They were outnumbered nearly 3-1, but they were united by one cause: to save the city and stop the Ottoman tide forever. On September 8, 1683, the Allied army began its final approach. They marched through the dense forests of the Vienna woods, moving slowly, their progress hidden from Ottoman scouts. Kara Mustafa could hear the distant echoes of cannon fire in the hills, but he underestimated what was coming. He believed that the Christians were few, disorganized, and no match for his strength. He did not know that among those marching through the forest were 18,000 of Sobieski's winged Hussars, the finest cavalry in the world. And as they advanced, their armor glinted in the sunlight, filtering through the trees. The sound of their horses echoed like a heartbeat across the valley. The wings on their backs whispered in the wind, heralding the storm that would soon descend upon the plains of Vienna. The stage was set. The city was broken, but unbowed. The Ottomans were confident, unaware of the thunder approaching from the north. And the world was about to witness one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of warfare, the charge that would destroy an empire and save a civilization. It was the morning of September 11th, 1683. The mist clung to the slopes north of Vienna, drifting through the trees like smoke over a sleeping battlefield. Beneath the canopy, tens of thousands of men stood ready. 70,000 soldiers from across Europe, Austrians, Germans, Bavarians, Saxons, and Poles, waited in silence. Every man there knew that the next day would decide not only the fate of Vienna, but perhaps the fate of all Christendom. King Jan III, Sobieski of Poland, stood at the edge of the Kahlenberg hill, gazing down upon the plains below. In the distance, the city of Vienna lay battered and broken, its towers scarred, its once proud walls shattered after 2 months of relentless siege. Between him and the city stretched the immense Ottoman camp, a sprawling sea of tents and banners glittering under the pale sun. It was the largest army the Sultan had ever sent into Europe, and somewhere within that camp waited Kara Mustafa Pasha, confident of victory. Sobieski studied the ground carefully, every ridge, every slope, every patch of forest. The long descending plain between the hills and the Ottoman lines was perfect terrain for cavalry. And at the bottom of that slope, the enemy had made a grave mistake. They had positioned their camp on low ground, their backs pressed against the Danube River. If they were forced to retreat, there would be nowhere to run. In that moment, Sobieski understood that the field itself would become his greatest ally. The plan began to form in his mind, clear and sharp as steel. That evening, the commanders of the Allied army gathered around a flickering fire. Charles of Lorraine would lead the imperial troops in the center. The Bavarians and Saxons would hold the left. Sobieski, with his Polish army, would take the right flank. They all knew their purpose. The infantry would engage the Ottomans head-on, pinning their army in place, while the Polish cavalry waited for the perfect moment to strike, the hammer that would fall and shatter the crescent once and for all. Night fell heavy and silent over the camps. Across the Christian lines, priests moved among the soldiers, offering prayers and blessings, hearing confessions by candlelight. Men knelt in the dirt, clutching their rosaries, whispering to God. On the opposite side of the valley, the imams of the Ottoman army did the same, calling their warriors to prayer, their voices rising and falling through the smoke-filled air. Between them, the great field of Vienna lay quiet, waiting for the dawn that would decide the fate of empires. The next morning, September 12th, broke cold and pale. As the fog lifted from the hills, the sound of cannon fire shattered the silence. The Battle of Vienna had begun. The Imperial and German troops moved first, advancing cautiously down the slopes toward the Ottoman positions. Drums thundered, muskets cracked, banners rippled in the morning light. The Ottomans, caught by surprise, scrambled to reposition their great guns, which, until that moment, had been trained on the walls of Vienna. Some cannons were too deeply entrenched to be moved, and many fired blindly into the smoke, unsure of where the enemy truly stood. Inside the city, Count Starhemberg heard the distant roar of battle. The defenders of Vienna, gaunt and starving but still unbroken, understood at once what it meant. Help had come. With renewed courage, Starhemberg ordered a sortie. The city's garrison, joined by volunteers and even civilians, stormed out through the breaches in the walls, attacking the Ottomans from within. The sudden assault threw the enemy's rear into chaos, forcing Kara Mustafa to divide his attention between holding the siege and confronting the advancing army from the north. For hours, the battle raged across the fields and vineyards. Smoke and dust clouded the air. The thunder of artillery rolled like a storm. The Janissaries, the elite soldiers of the Ottoman Empire, fought with grim determination, counterattacking again and again. The Allied infantry held their ground, step by bloody step. The field became a furnace of musket fire, cannon smoke, and death. Yet through it all, Sobieski waited. From his position on the hill, he watched the battle unfold like a chessboard. He could see where the Ottoman center held firm, where the flanks began to falter, and where the tide of battle shifted with each passing hour. His officers urged him to attack, but he shook his head. Timing was everything. The winged Hussars would not charge until the moment was absolutely right. Then, at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Sobieski saw it. The Ottoman reserves had been thrown into the center. Their left flank, directly below the Polish position, was weakening under pressure from the Imperial infantry. It was the opening he had been waiting for. He turned to his captains and gave the order that would change the course of history. The signal spread through the ranks. 18,000 horsemen began to move into position. The winged Hussars took the lead, their armor shining like mirrors in the sun. Behind them rode the pancerni, the armored cavalry, followed by lighter horsemen and supporting units. It was the largest cavalry formation assembled in Europe since the Crusades. From a distance, it looked like a living tide of steel and feathers. Sobieski rode to the front, his white horse stamping restlessly beneath him. He looked down at his men, noble men and warriors, veterans of countless battles, and raised his voice. "Today," he said, "we fight for God, for our faith, for our homes, and for all of Christendom, forward, and let the world remember us." He drew his sword and pointed it toward the Ottoman lines. The signal was given. The cavalry began to advance. At first, there was only the soft, rhythmic thud of hooves like the heartbeat of a giant. Then came the sound of thousands of lances rattling in unison, banners snapping in the wind. The pace quickened, from a walk to a trot, from a trot to a gallop. The sound grew into a rolling thunder that shook the very ground. As they descended, the great wooden wings mounted on their backs began to vibrate, producing a haunting, unearthly roar that filled the valley. To the Ottoman soldiers below, it was as if the sky itself had come alive with fury. Some stood frozen, others turned and ran. The Janissaries tried to form ranks, but it was too late. The winged Hussars struck like lightning. The first wave crashed into the Ottoman lines with the force of an avalanche. 6-meter-long lances punched through shields, armor, and flesh, impaling multiple men in a single thrust. Horses trampled over fallen bodies. Sabers flashed in the sun, slicing through limbs and armor alike. Before the Ottomans could recover, the second wave surged forward, then the third, then the fourth. Each line hit the enemy with perfect precision, knee to knee, shoulder to shoulder, maintaining formation even in the chaos. The Ottoman left flank disintegrated almost instantly. Panic spread through the camp. Soldiers fled toward the Danube, abandoning their weapons, trampling one another in terror. Sobieski and his men did not stop. They wheeled to the left and drove straight into the Ottoman center, striking from behind, while the Imperial infantry attacked from the front. The Ottoman army was trapped between hammer and anvil. Kara Mustafa tried desperately to rally his troops, but the noise was deafening. The roar of hooves, the crash of steel, the screams of the dying. His orders vanished into the wind, all discipline collapsed. The mighty army that had once marched with such confidence now dissolved into chaos. Tents burned. Horses bolted. Soldiers threw themselves into the river, trying to escape. The Danube turned red with blood. By nightfall, it was over. The greatest army the Ottoman Empire had ever sent into Europe had been destroyed. 15,000 lay dead on the field. Tens of thousands more were scattered, lost, or drowning in the dark waters behind them. The Allies had lost fewer than 2,000. It was one of the most decisive victories in history. When the sun rose the next morning, the city gates of Vienna opened for the first time in 2 months. The defenders, their faces hollow from hunger and sleepless nights, staggered out into the dawn and saw a sight they would never forget. King Jan III, Sobieski, riding at the head of his victorious army, the wings of his hussars glinting like gold in the early light. The people wept. Bells rang across the city. Starhemberg, the hero of the siege, met Sobieski at the gate. The two men clasped hands, soldiers who had stared into the abyss and survived. Sobieski dismounted, knelt on the broken earth, and prayed. That same day, he sent a message to the Pope. His words were simple and immortal. We came, we saw, and God conquered. The Battle of Vienna was won. The city was saved. Europe was saved. And the secret weapon, the unstoppable charge of the winged hussars, had written its legend into the pages of eternity. The morning after the battle, the air above Vienna was strangely still. The thunder of cannons had faded, replaced by the distant cries of scavengers and the murmured prayers of survivors. The battlefield stretched endlessly, carpeted with broken lances, shattered armor, and bodies lying in heaps. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the stench of blood and smoke. The once mighty Ottoman camp, which only days earlier had been a city of silk tents and golden pavilions, was now a wasteland of wreckage and silence. Kara Mustafa Pasha, the man who had sworn to deliver Vienna to the Sultan, fled through the chaos in the night, abandoning his standards and his treasure. His army, once 200,000 strong, no longer existed. The proud banners of the crescent moon that had waved so defiantly over Europe were trampled into the mud. Along the riverbanks, thousands of Ottoman soldiers struggled to escape, throwing away their weapons and armor to swim across the Danube. Few made it. The river claimed them, swallowing the remnants of a dream that had endured for centuries. At dawn, King Jan Sobieski rode slowly across the plain. Surveying the devastation, his armor was dented, his cloak torn, but his bearing was calm and steady. Around him, the men of Poland, Austria, and Germany gathered in triumph. Some laughed, some wept, and some simply stood in silence, unable to believe what they had accomplished. The impossible had happened. The greatest army the Ottoman Empire had ever sent into Europe had been utterly destroyed in a single afternoon. When Sobieski entered Vienna, the city erupted in celebration. Bells rang from every church tower. Crowds filled the streets, cheering and sobbing as they pressed forward to touch the hands of their saviors. Count Starhemberg, still wounded and pale from the siege, greeted the Polish king at the gates. He bowed deeply, then embraced him. There were no words strong enough to express what Vienna owed him. Sobieski, ever humble, refused the glory for himself. He ordered a mass of thanksgiving and knelt before the altar, his head bowed in prayer. He had not come for conquest or wealth. He had come to defend Christendom. That evening, in his field tent outside the city, Sobieski took up pen and parchment and wrote his famous message to Pope Innocent XI. Venimus, vidimus, Deus vicit, he wrote. We came, we saw, God conquered. Those few words traveled across Europe, igniting joy from Rome to Paris to Krakow. Bells rang in every cathedral. In cities and villages alike, people spoke of the miracle at Vienna. The tide of Ottoman expansion, which had seemed unstoppable for over 200 years, had finally been broken. For the Ottoman Empire, the defeat was catastrophic. Kara Mustafa returned to Constantinople a broken man. The Sultan received him coldly, his anger hidden behind silence. The news of the disaster had already spread through the empire, and whispers of divine punishment filled the streets. The dream of conquering Europe had died on the plains of Vienna. Within weeks of his return, Kara Mustafa was executed. Strangled with a silken cord, as was the custom for disgraced nobles, he paid the price for his arrogance. But the damage he had done to Ottoman prestige could not be undone. The myth of Ottoman invincibility, which had terrified Europe for centuries, was shattered. The victory at Vienna sparked a counter-offensive that would roll eastward for years. The Habsburgs, once on the brink of collapse, now seized the initiative. Imperial armies, joined by their Polish and German allies, pushed the Ottomans out of Hungary and into the Balkans. City after city that had endured decades of Ottoman rule was liberated. The empire that had reached the gates of Vienna now began its long, slow retreat from Europe. It would never again seriously threaten the heart of the continent. For Austria, the victory marked the beginning of a golden age. Freed from the fear of invasion, Vienna flourished. The city that had survived the siege became the center of a vast empire, its wealth and influence spreading across Europe. Palaces rose where fortifications once stood. The Ringstrasse, the grand boulevard that circles Vienna today, was later built along the line of the old city walls, walls that had once held against the might of an empire. For Poland, the triumph at Vienna was the greatest moment of its history. King John III. Sobieski was hailed across Europe as the savior of Christendom. The Pope called him the defender of civilization. Songs were written in his honor, and his name became legend. Yet Poland itself would gain little from its sacrifice. The campaign had drained its treasury and cost thousands of lives. In the decades that followed, internal division and foreign ambition would slowly tear the Commonwealth apart. By the end of the 18th century, the very nations that had fought beside Sobieski, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, would divide Poland among themselves, erasing it from the map for more than a century. There is a bitter irony in that. The country that had saved Europe from conquest would later vanish because Europe could not save it in return. And what of the winged Hussars, the secret weapon that had shattered the Ottoman Army? Their charge at Vienna was their masterpiece, the final and greatest expression of a form of warfare that had ruled the battlefield for centuries. It was also their last true victory. The world was changing. Firearms were improving. Infantry formations were becoming deadlier. Artillery grew more accurate and devastating. The age of armored knights and massed cavalry charges was ending. Within a few decades, the winged Hussars would fade into legend, their wings and armor preserved only in paintings, songs, and stories. But their legacy would endure as long as courage and heroism were remembered. The charge of the Hussars became a symbol of everything that Europe believed in: faith, unity, sacrifice, and the triumph of courage against impossible odds. For generations afterward, poets and painters tried to capture that moment: the sunlight flashing on steel, the thunder of hooves, the sound of wings rushing like a storm. To Poles, it became a source of national pride. To all of Europe, it was a reminder that even in the darkest hour, heroes can change the course of history. The lessons of Vienna went beyond the battlefield. The victory showed what could happen when divided nations stood together. For more than a century, Europe had been torn apart by religious wars: Catholics against Protestants, monarchs against princes, nation against nation. But when the Ottoman threat loomed over Vienna, those divisions were set aside. Germans, Poles, Austrians, and Italians fought shoulder to shoulder, united by a common purpose. It was that unity, more than numbers or weapons, that saved Europe. It also showed the power of leadership. Sobieski was not a ruler who commanded from a safe distance. He led from the front, charging beside his men, risking his life as they did. His soldiers saw their king among them, and that sight gave them strength. Leadership like that cannot be taught. It must be born from conviction, his faith in God, his belief in the righteousness of his cause, and his courage inspired an army and changed the world. There was another lesson too: the importance of preparation and timing. The winged Hussars were not simply brave men on horseback. They were the product of centuries of refinement, of training, discipline, and innovation. Their armor, weapons, and tactics represented the pinnacle of military design. When used at the right place, at the right time, under the right leader, they became unstoppable. Kara Mustafa had more men, more cannons, and greater resources, but Sobieski had understanding of terrain, of psychology, of the human spirit. That understanding was what turned victory into destiny. In the centuries since the battle, the world has changed beyond recognition. Empires have risen and fallen, borders have shifted, faiths have intertwined, and technology has reshaped war itself. Yet the story of Vienna endures because it speaks to something timeless. It reminds us that history is not written by inevitability or by numbers alone. It is written by the courage of individuals who refuse to yield. It is written by those who act when all seems lost. If you stand today on the hill of Kahlenberg, you can still see the city of Vienna spread out before you. There is a church there built to commemorate the battle. From its terrace, you can trace with your eyes the path that the Hussars rode down more than 3 centuries ago. The vineyards still grow on those slopes, the same ground that thundered beneath the hooves of Sobieski's cavalry. And if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it, the distant rumble of hooves, the whisper of wings, the echo of a charge that saved a civilization. The victory at Vienna changed the direction of the world. It ended the age of Ottoman expansion and marked the rise of Central Europe. It gave birth to myths and legends, to symbols of faith and defiance. And it left behind one of the most extraordinary stories in human history: how a single army, led by a single man, riding beneath a storm of wings, turned the tide of centuries and preserved the world we know today. When the smoke finally cleared from the fields of Vienna, something remarkable began to happen. The people of the city emerged from their ruins not only to celebrate survival, but to begin rebuilding a world that would soon change forever. The victory of September 12, 1683, was not just the end of a siege. It was the rebirth of Europe. It was as though, from the ashes of the broken walls, a new civilization began to breathe again. The first transformation was spiritual. Across Europe, the churches rang their bells, and prayers of thanksgiving were said in every language. The Pope declared a feast day to commemorate the victory, honoring it as a miracle granted by divine providence. To the Christian world, the triumph at Vienna was not merely a military success, but a sacred sign that faith had triumphed over fear, that courage had overcome the darkness that had threatened to consume Europe. In Poland, Austria, and Italy, painters began to immortalize the moment in vast canvases that still hang in cathedrals today. John III, Sobieski on his white horse, sword raised, the banners of the crescent trampled beneath the hooves of his hussars. To the ordinary people of Vienna, the victory was more tangible. The city that had starved under siege suddenly overflowed with abundance. The Ottoman camp, abandoned in haste, was filled with unimaginable treasures: gold, jewels, silks, spices, and strange goods from the distant corners of the empire. Among the captured riches was something that would quietly transform European culture in ways few could have predicted: sacks and sacks of dark, aromatic beans. Coffee. The Ottomans had brought it with them, as they always did, for their soldiers and officers. To the Viennese, it was an exotic curiosity, bitter and unfamiliar. A clever Polish merchant and former spy named Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki, who had served as a messenger during the siege, recognized its value. As part of his reward for bravery, he requested several of the captured sacks. Using them, he opened the first coffee house in Vienna. It became an instant sensation. People from every class came to taste this strange, invigorating drink that had once been the fuel of their enemies. In time, the city became the heart of a new European coffee culture. The Viennese café, with its marble tables and the hum of conversation, became a symbol of sophistication and intellect. Philosophers, artists, and writers would gather in these coffee houses to discuss ideas that would shape the modern world. And it all began with the spoils of the Ottoman defeat. But the battle left other marks on daily life, too. There is an old legend, often told but never fully proven, that the bakers of Vienna, who had worked through the nights during the siege, were the first to hear the Ottoman miners tunneling beneath the walls. When the siege was lifted, those same bakers celebrated by creating a pastry shaped like the crescent moon of the Ottoman flag. They called it the croissant. Whether the story is fact or folklore, the symbolism remains powerful. The sweet taste of victory, the transformation of a symbol of fear into one of joy. As the decades passed, Vienna grew into a city of splendor. The Habsburgs poured wealth into it, constructing palaces, churches, and theaters. The scars of war were covered with marble and music. The very streets that had once echoed with the clash of steel now rang with the compositions of Mozart and Haydn. The city that had stood on the edge of destruction became a beacon of art and culture, the heart of Europe's new age of enlightenment. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire began its long decline. Though it would endure for centuries more, its power was broken. The defeat at Vienna had shattered its prestige and revealed the limits of its reach. In the years that followed, European armies drove the Ottomans steadily backward, out of Hungary, out of the Balkans, and eventually back to the gates of their own lands. The empire that had once threatened to consume Europe would itself become known as the sick man of Europe, its strength fading as its rivals grew. And yet, even in defeat, the Ottomans left their influence behind. The exchange between East and West of goods, ideas, and technologies did not end with the battle. It changed form. The borders stabilized, and trade resumed. Ottoman textiles, spices, and music continued to reach European cities, while European science, art, and architecture began to spread eastward. The war that had divided civilizations now gave birth to a strange kind of unity, a shared history born from conflict. The Battle of Vienna also reshaped the idea of Europe itself. For centuries, the continent had been divided by faith and politics. The Reformation had torn it apart. The wars of religion had bled it dry. But in 1683, at least for a moment, the nations of Europe remembered what they shared. Catholics and Protestants, Germans and Poles, Austrians and Italians stood together under one cause. They discovered that when they were united, they could achieve what had seemed impossible. That lesson would echo through the centuries, returning again in moments of crisis when Europe faced new threats. For Poland, the memory of Vienna became sacred. Though the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth would later fall, the legend of Sobieski and the winged Hussars endured in the national soul. Painters depicted them as divine warriors. Poets wrote of them as angels of vengeance, descending from the heavens to save the world. Even in the darkest days of Poland's partitions, when the country ceased to exist, the memory of Vienna reminded the Polish people that they had once saved civilization itself. As for the winged Hussars, their image grew into myth. The sight of their great feathered wings became a symbol of invincibility, of the moment when courage and faith overcame impossible odds. Centuries later, military historians would study their tactics, engineers would admire their armor, and storytellers would invoke their charge as one of the greatest feats in the history of warfare. Their legend would inspire painters, filmmakers, and even soldiers in modern times who looked to them as the embodiment of bravery. To walk through Vienna today is to walk through the aftermath of that victory. The city's elegance, its architecture, its music, even its cafes, all bear traces of that moment in history when everything changed. The Baroque palaces that line the Ringstrasse were built with the wealth that flowed in after the Ottomans' defeat. The great churches, with their soaring domes and golden altars, were raised in thanksgiving for deliverance. The very name of Kahlenberg, the hill from which Sobieski launched his charge, still carries the weight of legend. If you climb that hill now, you will find a church dedicated to the battle, standing where Sobieski prayed before he led his men into the storm. From its terrace, the view stretches across the vineyards and the river, over the city that was once a battlefield. The landscape is peaceful now, but if you listen closely, imagination will fill the silence. You can almost hear the faint echo of hooves in the wind, the ghostly flutter of wings, and the distant cry of victory that once rolled across the plains. History rarely turns in a single afternoon, but that day it did. The 12th of September, 1683, marked the end of one age and the beginning of another. It was the day Europe was saved from conquest, the day the Ottoman advance was broken, the day the course of the world changed direction. And it was all decided by the courage of men on horseback, by the unity of nations long divided, and by a faith that refused to yield. The Battle of Vienna stands as one of those moments when history seems to hold its breath, when the choices of a few shape the destiny of millions. It reminds us that no empire, however vast, is invincible, and that no cause, however desperate, is hopeless when courage and conviction meet. It reminds us that civilization itself is fragile, but also that it can endure if there are those willing to defend it. The charge of the winged Hussars remains one of the most astonishing feats in military history. But beyond that, it remains a symbol of something deeper, the belief that when darkness rises, there will always be those who ride against it, wings spread wide, carrying the hopes of an entire world. And so, as the centuries pass and the echoes of that thunder fade, the legend endures. The city still stands. The empire that besieged it has vanished. But the story of Vienna, of courage, unity, and the wings of salvation, continues to whisper through time, reminding us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, light can prevail, faith can endure, and history can be rewritten by the will of the brave. Centuries have passed since the thunder of hooves shook the hills of Vienna, yet the echoes of that day have never truly faded. The Battle of Vienna was not only a clash of armies, but a turning point in the story of humanity. A moment when the course of civilizations shifted because men chose to stand and fight when surrender would have been easier. Time has covered the battlefield with vineyards and city streets, but beneath that quiet soil lie the memories of courage and the faint whispers of history's heartbeat. The legacy of September 12, 1683, is not just a tale of swords and banners. It is a lesson about what it means to rise together in the face of overwhelming darkness. The world that emerged after Vienna was not perfect, but it was changed. Europe, long divided by pride, religion, and politics, had discovered through necessity the power of unity. For one brief moment, princes and kings, Catholics and Protestants, nations that had hated and fought each other, remembered that they shared a destiny worth defending. That spirit of solidarity, the belief that what binds us is stronger than what divides us, remains one of the most important lessons of that day. The second lesson is one of leadership. John III. Sobieski was not the most powerful king in Europe, nor did he command the largest army. What he possessed was something rarer: vision, conviction, and humility. He did not see himself as a conqueror, but as a servant of a cause greater than himself. When he rode at the head of his men, he did not ride for glory but for duty, faith, and the future of his people. His leadership was not imposed by fear, but inspired by example. And that kind of leadership, the courage to act, to bear responsibility, and to lead from the front, is the kind that history remembers. The third lesson lies in the nature of history itself. Great events are rarely decided by inevitability. They are shaped by human choices, by the decisions of individuals who, in critical moments, refuse to yield. Had Sobieski ignored the Pope's call, had the German princes allowed their rivalries to prevail, had the defenders of Vienna surrendered a few days earlier, the map of the world might look very different today. The fate of millions often turns on the courage of a few. That truth is as old as civilization itself, and as relevant now as it was then. The fourth lesson is one of faith, not only religious faith, but faith in meaning, in purpose, in the belief that what we fight for matters. For the soldiers at Vienna, this was more than a battle of territory. It was a battle for identity, for the survival of a way of life, for the hope that their children would live free. They believed that God was with them, and that belief gave them the strength to endure when everything seemed lost. Whether one shares their faith or not, the power of conviction, of believing in something greater than oneself, remains one of humanity's most powerful weapons against despair. And finally, there is the lesson of legacy. The Battle of Vienna was the beginning of the end for the Ottoman dream of conquering Europe. It marked the decline of one empire and the rise of others. But beyond politics and borders, its true legacy lies in what it revealed about the human spirit. The men who fought there, Poles, Austrians, Germans, Italians, did not know they were shaping the next chapter of history. They only knew that if they failed, everything they loved would be lost. And in that knowledge, they found the strength to do the impossible. Today, when we walk through Vienna, it is hard to imagine that this beautiful city of music, art, and elegance was once the stage for such a desperate struggle. Tourists sip coffee in the cafes that trace their origins to that battle, unaware that the aroma filling the air is part of the story that began amid fire and blood. Children chase pigeons across squares built over the old fortifications. The churches that once shook with the sound of cannons now echo with the gentle harmony of choirs. The city lives, vibrant, peaceful, and free, a living monument to those who fought for it. The battlefield itself has become a symbol, not of war, but of resilience. On Kahlenberg Hill, where Sobieski knelt in prayer before leading the charge, a church now stands. From its terrace, one can look out over the vineyards, the river, and the rooftops of Vienna. The scene is tranquil, but the past is never far away. The wind that moves through the vines seems to carry the faint hum of hooves, the distant murmur of wings, and the echo of voices calling to battle. It is a place where history breathes softly, reminding those who visit that peace is always built upon the courage of those who refused to surrender. In Poland, the memory of the winged Hussars endures like a flame that will not die. They are more than soldiers now. They are symbols of honor, faith, and defiance. In art, in music, and in the hearts of the Polish people, their wings still shine. To many, they represent the moment when a nation became eternal, not through conquest, but through sacrifice. The same can be said of all who stood on that field, of every soldier, noble or common, who believed that courage and unity could overcome fear. The story of the Battle of Vienna is not just a story about the past. It is a mirror for the present. The enemies we face today are different, not armies with banners and cannons, but divisions, ignorance, and apathy. Yet the lessons are the same. Unity matters, leadership matters, courage matters, faith matters. The belief that something is worth defending, that something is worth standing for, is what keeps civilization alive. And so, the secret weapon that destroyed the Ottoman army was not only the charge of the winged Hussars. It was not merely steel, strategy, or skill. It was the will to fight for something greater than victory. It was the union of courage, intelligence, faith, and purpose. The strength that comes when people stand together, even when the odds seem hopeless. That was the true weapon that saved Vienna. That was the weapon that shaped the modern world. More than 300 years have passed since that day, but the story remains alive, told in classrooms, whispered in cathedrals, painted on canvas, and remembered in the hearts of those who still believe that courage can change history. It reminds us that civilizations are not defined by their wealth or their armies, but by their resolve to endure. It reminds us that every generation faces its own siege, and that every age must find its own Sobieski, its own defenders, its own wings. In the end, the Battle of Vienna was more than a victory. It was a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. It was proof that even when darkness surrounds us, even when defeat seems certain, there will always be those who rise, those who charge into the storm, those who carry the light. And as long as the story of Vienna is told, As long as we remember the sound of those wings over the hills, the world will know that there is no army more powerful than faith, no weapon stronger than courage, and no victory greater than the triumph of the human will.